So you've got a case here where he feels that race was being used to avoid a situation of her being evicted, and she did it successfully. Chris is obviously concerned that he is going to be found somehow negligent, that he didn't address the issue properly, and he doesn't want to support an environment that people are racist and harassing each other.
Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University Night School. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing this evening?
Doing good, Jeff. I'm especially excited today because as we always do, we encourage people to reach out to us, to give us suggestions for topics, ask their questions, and send them to landlordu@rentprep.com. And today's topic comes from a listener who submitted a great question and recommended that we cover the topic on the podcast. So Chris from Cleveland wrote in and gave us a situation that he's dealing with, and I wanted to cover basically from his end, what his issue is and what our response is. And Jeff, you and I can bounce off some ideas and discuss maybe the best way to approach this kind of a bad situation that he's dealing with.
Yeah.
So, again, Chris from Cleveland, he purchased a fourplex about 3 months ago, and he inherited three of the tenants that were occupied in there. Um, the issue or the problem, the confrontation that happened was between two of the tenants, and he gives a pretty good detailed description of them, which we really appreciate. So I will explain exactly how he details the different tenants. So the first tenant is a white female, mid 50s, pays her rent like clockwork. She's been there for about 10 years. He also mentions that she shows some symptoms of Asperger's syndrome, which will become important as we unravel the story here. The second tenant is a black female tenant. Um, Said that she's been there for about 3 years. Says that she pays late every month, but she does pay. So he doesn't specify, but I'm guessing that means she's probably paying on the third or the fifth when the rent's due on the first.
Right. He also mentions that she is very pleasant and they're planning to do some upgrades to her unit to keep her there. So they like her as a tenant, even though she might be a few days late each month.
Right. So the fact that the first tenant, the white female in her mid 50s, he feels that she may have Asperger's syndrome because he wrote, in his opinion, she could be perfectly pleasant one day and the next day spewing unprovoked profanity. And the situation that unfolded was the two of them, as he described, came to blows during the weekend. The police were called, no charges were pressed, but the white female tenant was using some racial slurs towards the black female tenant. So Chris uses a property manager, and the property manager recommended that he write a letter to the white female tenant. And his question to us directly was, do we think he should write a letter to both? And what our thoughts were on the situation. So, um, I guess kind of covering. Let's start with something that jumped out at me was the fact that he thought that she may have Asperger's syndrome,
Yes.
because I think that kind of throws a twist into it. Um, if he feels that, and anybody who's ever dealt with anyone who's had Asperger's knows that obviously social awkwardness is one thing that comes with it, not always understanding or knowing, um, what's appropriate or what's not. So that may be a bigger issue playing into this here. It doesn't make it right. I'm not trying to condone what she did, but if there's any middle ground to be found, I feel like we can use that. Chris can use that as maybe to try and build some understanding, if that's even possible.
Yes.
So in Chris's question, he said that should he write a letter to both? My opinion is absolutely. I wouldn't let it go unchecked on one side or the other. You want to address it. You want to make both aware that you're addressing the issue, not only the offender, but also the victim will say, so that she doesn't feel that it was just sort of swept under the rug either.
Yes, that's important. You want to be sure that you let that tenant know that you are taking care of this. You have responded to the other tenant to let them know what your expectations are of them as a tenant. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind the ultimate situation here is that they came to blows. I'm assuming there was physical contact, physical altercations, and that's stepping over a line for both tenants. So although you want to be very respectful of the tenant who is being receiving the racial slurs, and you want to be sure to let them know that, hey, I've told the other tenant that that is not acceptable behavior. But at the same time, if you came to blows with this person, then obviously there was some sort of situation that you may have been a part of. And I need you to understand that if you are involved in this, if you attack a tenant, just like if a tenant attacks you physically, then I'm going to be at a point where you're going to have your tenancy at risk as well.
And I agree. And you know what? I didn't even pick up on that as I read through here. You're right. And he wrote verbatim that they had come to blows. I just assumed that it was a verbal altercation, but you're right. I mean, the situation, it was a physical altercation. And, if the police were called out and no charges were pressed, there could be two reasons for that. Maybe the tenant number two, the black female, didn't want to press charges,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe the police didn't find enough, evidence, or maybe it didn't, wasn't physical. I don't know. He
Yeah.
never specified or elaborated any further on that. But I agree, it does change the situation if it was a physical altercation. So let's deal with it from both angles. Let's first assume that it was a physical altercation. So if it was physical, if the tenant number one, the white female tenant, who is suspected of having Asperger's, if she did assault the black female tenant as a landlord, how would you handle that?
If one of my tenants assaults another tenant, I'm
Hmm.
going to evict that tenant.
Yeah,
The
I agree.
problem is, how do you get to the bottom of who assaulted whom?
Well, without the police backing you up in this case, it would have
Yeah,
been
that's what
nice.
I was thinking too.
Yeah, it would have been nice if there was charges, because then you have something to base it on, right? But yeah, I mean, if okay, so if it's cut and dry that the white female tenant assaulted the black female tenant, let's just assume that the white female takes responsibility for it, says, "Yeah, that happened." The black female tenant says, "You know what? I didn't press charges because I've got to live with this woman, and I just figured, calling the police was enough, and just to let her know that's, I've reached my limit," or whatever the case was. I would still evict the white female tenant, even though she's been a good tenant for 10 years. Some landlords may disagree with that, but once you have a situation where there's assault, physical harm being inflicted, you have to take swift action. I mean, you can't have people living, especially in a fourplex, you can't have people living in an environment that's not safe for
Right.
others. So that to me is probably the easiest answer to give, because that is very cut and dry to me.
Now, shall I throw a little bit of a wrinkle into this?
Yeah, yeah,
The landlord expects that that tenant has Asperger's, which may contribute to those actions.
yeah.
I'm not an expert,
Hmm.
and I don't know if that is or isn't the case, but you start to get into discrimination issues and protection issues. So you may or may not be able to just evict that tenant,
Yeah.
and you definitely want to be working with an attorney.
You brought up such a great point there. I didn't even think of that at first with the protected class issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wow, that's more than a little wrinkle. You're right. I mean, okay, so I guess probably important for the landlord to really understand, is that his opinion or is that a fact that she has Asperger's syndrome?
Right. And I think just because he has that impression that she might have Asperger's makes me think you don't want to go evicting this tenant without
Hmm.
running it by an attorney and let the attorney know. In my opinion, this person has Asperger's. Now, again, I'm not sure that Asperger's really is the diagnosis here because of what this person, how this person acts. But if you as a layperson have that thought, that opinion that somebody has a medical condition that is causing this type of action, then at that point, you don't want to expose yourself to risk and make a decision or determination to evict somebody without getting legal advice.
Now, I guess to also to add to that wrinkle, since we're talking about protected classes, Chris, who wrote into us, included a link to an article that I'll just briefly touch on. I guess the major points of it. I was really disheartened by this article.
Yes.
Which basically tells a story very similar to his case. So obviously, Chris had done some research, came across this article that happened in a situation that happened in Massachusetts, somewhat similar. Two tenants at odds with each other, one black, one white. Except in this situation, the one tenant happened to be the black tenant, was being threatened to be evicted because she hadn't paid her rent, and he felt that she was making a case to basically, avoid eviction and avoid being or having to pay that rent back. And in that article, it explains, sort of and we should probably include a link to that article in the show notes, so we'll do that too.
Yes.
But in the article, it again, just to kind of summarize it, the landlord was found legally responsible and had to pay damages to the tenant, the black tenant, who was going to be evicted because the landlord was found to have failed to take action to stop other tenants from making discriminatory statements or threatening and harassing the other tenant on basis of race. And I think it's also important to point out that the landlord himself was black as well. So you've got a case here where he feels that race was being used to avoid a situation of her being evicted, and she did it successfully. And so I think Chris is obviously concerned from the perspective of being a landlord that he is going to be found somehow negligent, that he didn't address the issue properly, and he doesn't want to obviously, support an environment that people are racist and harassing each other. So he's really, he's in a quandary on what he should do. And I think just based on the article, based on everything that we know and everything that we're always preaching about communication, I think the first step, whether it was physical, verbal, whatever the case is to get a letter to both of them and begin the lines of communication. Get both of the sides of the story. You need to feel out from the black female tenant how she feels. Does she feel unsafe? Does she feel uncomfortable? Is this going to be something that continues? Was this a one-time thing? Is she willing to forgive and forget? Is she not willing to forgive and forget? Is she willing to take into consideration maybe some of the, social issues that the first tenant has? So, I think the line of communication needs to be opened there, and that landlord, um, I would think, needs to step in above the property manager and handle this, because at the end of the day, it's going to be he's the one who's going to suffer the repercussions if there are any.
Yes.
So I wouldn't leave it up to the property manager at this point. I would personally write two letters and at least acknowledge the situation. If for nothing else, like we mentioned before, for the black female tenant, if she's the victim, at least acknowledge that she's been the victim of something. You don't want to just make her feel like it's been swept under the rug and it's not going to be dealt with. But then also lay down some repercussions, ground rules, whatever you come to for the white female tenant who happens to be the offender here. Make sure that she understands it's not acceptable. If it's something that they're not going to be able to get past and one person has to go, I think I'm with you on this, Jeff. I think that the white female tenant, even though she's been there for 10 years, doesn't matter. That you're going to have a problem down the road, and it's not going to be one you're going to want to deal with.
Yes, exactly. There are a couple of things. One of the things would be, it would make sense to contact the police to see if a report was written. I would expect that they took statements from each of them, and there's a record of that the landlord should be able to get a copy of, to get an understanding of what the statements were to the police. You certainly could reach out to each of the tenants and get their statements from them, but the police will have a statement that may or may not include a summary from the police officer who took the report, but it'll at least give you the statements of the tenants. And that might give you a little bit of a clue as to what happened. Again, in my opinion, if one of my tenants physically assaults another one of my tenants, they're gone. I'm not going to have people like that in my properties. You mentioned something, and I had an interesting thought about it. If I'm renting to somebody who turns out to be racist, as much as I don't like that, if they turn out to be racist, but they never express that to other tenants, then that's not going to be a cause for me to evict them or to terminate their lease or to not lease to them or renew their lease when their lease is up. If that's something that they believe in and they keep to themselves, I'm going to let that be. But the minute it goes outside and it starts to affect other tenants in the building, that's the point at which, even if I don't evict them immediately, when their lease is up, they're going to be gone. So this white female tenant who throws racial slurs at the black female tenant, as Chris put it, to me, even if they hadn't come to blows, if the black tenant told me that this was what was happening, I would send a letter to the white tenant and let them know that this is not acceptable behavior and that I would expect that this would not continue, and that if it does, I won't be renewing their lease when it comes up.
Right.
But the minute they come to blows, it's all over. And when you have a fourplex like that, you have to keep in mind, what is the dynamic of the tenants? And yeah, you might have a tenant who is paying their rent on time every time. They've been there for 10 years, but at what point is that person causing you not to be able to keep good quality tenants in the other units? So you might think, this is great. I've got the perfect tenant. They keep their place clean. They pay their rent on time. They've been there for 10 years. They're going to be there for another 10 years. I'm golden. But those other 3 units that keep turning over, maybe there's a reason for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're sacrificing 3 units for the sake of one in that case. So you could have 3 other tenants in there that might be long-term tenants. So that's a great point that you make there. Consider the other tenants and that dynamic there, and that could be a huge reason for a big turnover, that
Yep.
nobody wants to live next to the racist lady upstairs.
Yes. And it doesn't have to be someone who's racist.
Mhm.
As landlords, we need to keep in mind how that community is working, especially when you have something like a fourplex or an eightplex or something where people do have to live in close proximity on your property. It might just be somebody who's just not a nice person.
Mhm. Yeah.
And at what point is it worth it to you to get their check on time
Mhm.
every time? And is it costing you money to get their rent every month? That's an interesting
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Now, I also know some management companies that do this, that will actually hold. I haven't heard of a landlord doing this firsthand yet, but it's a great idea. Property management companies that will basically hold, I don't know, for lack of better terms, maybe like an arbitration type of a meeting where you can sit both parties down. You have a person kind of mediating the conversation and in the meeting, and see if you can get it out and resolve the issue without having to take legal action or the worry that someone else is going to take legal action. We talk about it all the time. Lack of communication is, the number one offender, I think, for landlords that choose to not address things, and then things fester and get out of control. But if you can address the situation early, get both people sitting down, who knows? Maybe they'll reconcile their differences. Maybe they won't. But
Right.
you at least have to cross that bridge and see if that's a possibility before anything else. If it's not major situation where somebody was physically accosted or something like that.
And when it's somebody who is being disrespectful to somebody else by using racial slurs, and that to me is a situation where you just tell them it's not acceptable, you can't do it. And you certainly want to have a conversation with them. Is there something that's causing them to be uh, to say those things, even though we don't agree with people saying that? Maybe there's something more underlying. Maybe that person has been parking their car too close to theirs and they can't open the door, and they're not being reasonable in something they're doing. And even though the person who feels offended and is thus using racial slurs because of it, maybe there's an underlying reason for it that needs to be mediated. But If there's nothing like that, then it comes back to don't do that.
Yeah.
And if you do, you're not going to be around. But if it's something else, if it's a situation where people are just, back and forth, well, you parked too close to me, so I'm going to do X in retaliation. That's a good time to try to sit them down and just have a conversation
Hmm.
and let them know your ultimate goal is to make it a good place for everybody to live. And it can't be a good place if you're all angry with each other and upset with each other. What can we do to resolve this? Is there something I as a landlord can do? Can I put a little bit of a gate between, or a fence between the two units, or can I do something else? People often do respond to those things. Do they always respond? No, not at all. But it's worth the effort. And then through those conversations, you might be better prepared to make the decision as to which person you want gone.
Right. And I would say, just to elaborate on that, I think you bring up a really good point. The majority of the conflict between tenants is usually stemming from some sort of what one person perceives as an inconsideration, like you said, parking too close, something like that. And it's usually not dealt with right away. It usually happens a lot of times before it ends up coming out. And then maybe it turns into a complaint, or you might receive a phone call or a letter from a tenant saying, hey, this person's doing this or whatever. It is definitely, like you said, a good idea to sit both parties down and try and resolve that, because the longer you let it go on, the worse it's going to get. It's going to get to a point where you may have only heard about it once, but this person living there has been dealing with it every single day for the past 6 months and has reached their limit.
Yes.
So, you want to get that stuff out. Definitely a good idea during an annual inspection. Get a feel, how are things with the other tenants? Anytime you live in close proximity with somebody, it's a perfect recipe for disaster.
Yes, it
So
is.
you're going to run into situations. People are not always going to be thoughtful, and in a lot of cases maybe they don't even know they're being thoughtless. Maybe the other person wasn't even aware that they were parking too close. They just never gave it a second thought. Who knows? But when somebody comes at you angry, I think most people have a tendency to be defensive, and that's usually when it turns into something much bigger instead of a easygoing conversation. Hey, you park close to me sometimes. I can't really open my door. Could you do me a favor and scoot it over or something?
Hmm.
Unfortunately, it's usually not a conversation like that. It's usually, hey, jerk, I can't deal with this anymore. And then it becomes bigger than it had to have been from the beginning. So, again, that communication is important. Getting a sense from the tenants, maybe ahead of time, inspection, anything like that, where you can just have a conversation. How are things going? And try to get that stuff out.
We talk often about having conversations and providing material to tenants when you first sign the lease. And one of the things, if you have a multi-unit complex, maybe four, maybe a little bit more, it wouldn't hurt to create some type of a conflict resolution document that talks to tenants about, if you have problems with other tenants, here are some steps you can take. First of all, you can talk to them and work your way through the process of contacting the property manager or the landlord, whoever's in charge, about those situations, and put some sample situations. This person is always parking on the street in front of my door. Well, unfortunately, it's not illegal. It might be annoying because that's where you would like to park, but at the same time, it's the city street, so they can park there. And having something in writing that talks to them about how they can solve these types of situations amongst themselves might not be a bad idea. Again, if you've got a larger complex, it could make a lot of sense because these people are living in those close quarters, and it can definitely make some people a little bit crazy.
Just to close out the conversation about Chris's situation and dealing with, potentially racist tenants, things like that, especially after reading the article that he shared, it's a good idea to check with your local police department, like you mentioned, to see if what the police have documented in that specific case, but then also ask them how it should be handled. And I think a lot of times the police will give you good direction or might point you in the right direction. Check with your local municipality. Attorney General's office is a an authority that would handle issues like this as well. And in Massachusetts, it was the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, or MCAD, that ended up pressing the charges against the landlord and fining him. So check with your local municipality, your local state, get some information on it if you're in a situation like this, to find out what the right answer is and how to deal with it correctly to the letter of the law and what they would want you to do. So you're not putting yourself in a situation to lose, you know?
Yeah.
So, it's a good idea to just educate yourself as much as possible locally, what can be done, and then handle the issue from there and make sure you're handling it very appropriately, because the last thing you want as a landlord is to have to pay damages to another tenant or be labeled as the landlord that allowed discrimination to happen, and now you're legally responsible for it.
Yes, exactly. Well, great, Stephen. I think that wraps up another episode of Night School. I look forward to talking with you tomorrow evening.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, Chris, for reaching out to us.
Yes, very much so.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University. And remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.